the nature of the work we do. Often, I'm sure many of you can relate. And I should tell you that I'm joining you from from my location now, which is Corvallis, Oregon, which is also the ancestral territory of the Kalapuya people, whose living descendants are part of the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde community of Oregon, and the Confederated Tribes of the Siletz Indians. And I really like to situate myself in that way, because I know that the way that I look at the world around me is and the types of knowledge that I'm trying to create is really fundamentally shaped by where I am and the human geography of where I am. And where I am now is on this stolen land that also happens to be where I was born and grew up. And I never heard anything about Kalapuya people growing up in Oregon in the 1980s and 1990s, in the public schools that I went to during that time. I never heard of colonialism. I never heard about land rights. And it wasn't until actually I lived in Canada on the unceded Coast Salish territories that I lived in there that I began my personal educational journey about how I relate to those processes of colonialism as a settler, and what my role as a settler in these spaces does to my view of the topics that I'm interested in. So that's how I kind of want to begin this talk today. And let me just pop into presentation mode here. So as Jonathan kindly mentioned, I am a postdoctoral scholar with the Cascadia Coastlines People's Hazards Research Hub here at Oregon State University. It's a National Science Foundation funded research hub based here at OSU, with a lot of different scholars in a lot of different fields and disciplines looking at Cascadia subduction zone hazards on the coast. And my talk today is going to be a little bit unusual because I decided that one of the ways I'm going to introduce myself today is basically I would love to take an opportunity to literally introduce myself, since I don't know all of you, and because I'm a fellow network member and a new member to the network, and also a UBC alum. I just wanted to start a little bit with how my background brought me to this present line of inquiry, which I will then share with you. And apologies if this is a bit too much information for some, but as a critical, radical, queer geographer, one of the things that I really like to do is to practice radical transparency about how I participate in research and about how I like to produce knowledge. And that includes locating myself in some of this work and in relation to the people and places that I live. And in particular, if any of you, I know you, Jonathan, are an early career scholar. If there are others who are earlier along in your careers, I really like to do this for them, because where and when and why and for whom we do research, I think is extremely important to understanding the work that we do. And those are often things that aren't really discussed when we do research. So, and I think that's weird. I think we should talk about, like, you know, who we are in relation to the worlds that we look at. So anyway, that's all of my preamble here. This is just a quick rundown of how I'm going to take you through this talk. And so here's what my background looks like, I guess, from the outside, if you don't know much about me. As you can see, I'm fast on my way to a lucrative and illustrious future. And yeah, that's me in a nutshell, career-wise. But that's not really the whole story, of course. And I don't know if that last little dot is actually going to pan out. Time will tell. This is the real backstory on me, and the story that you might not otherwise get if you read only peer-reviewed journal articles, and if you didn't really come to this talk, I guess. And again, I share all of this because I think that the context in which I understand the world around me matters just as much, if not more, than what kinds of knowledge I produce with the research that I do. And that's something I think that's really missing in the way that people think about disasters and disaster research and how to manage disaster and understand risk and things like that, how we adapt to the changes that we see in the environment. So yeah, I'm just laying it all out there for you. So I grew up here where I'm joining you from in Oregon. I left here just about as quickly as I could as a teenager and moved to Japan to get away from Oregon because I didn't like it here. It was homophobic and weird, and I was not experiencing a joyous teen lifestyle. So I thought, I'll get as far away from here as I can. And so I moved to Japan, ended up meeting my wife. We moved to British Columbia in 2010. We got legally married there because at the time that option was not available to us in the US and also in Japan, which is still not available. I wrote about Tokyo underground lesbian dance parties for my master's at UVic. And then the fieldwork for that project ended up taking place immediately after the 2011 disasters during what some folks call the dark spring in Japan. There were blackouts. There was a lot of really painful experiences that people had just gone through. And it was a really tough time for a lot of folks. And being there as I was to do interviews with queer and trans folks in Tokyo, I started thinking more about what the connection between disaster and marginality and gender and sexual minority marginality might be. Ended up finishing that project. We moved to Vancouver, had kids in 2016, 2017, and I began the PhD there in UBC geography around the same time. During that period, all four of us moved to Tohoku for a year with funding from the Japan Foundation to undertake field work for my PhD. And my wife took care of the two kids during that year while I was off running around Tohoku doing interviews and trying to get the material that I needed for my project. So that was what made that possible. And then in 2020, I finally finished the PhD at UBC Geography and wrote about LGBT community groups and recovery from the 2011 disasters. Spent about a year trying to teach and make money and think about my job situation after that. Ended up getting an offer from Oregon State to do this postdoc and moved everyone down the West Coast to where we currently are in Corvallis. So that's where I'm at right now with my kind of timeline. And with that, I will just take you through a little bit of background on generally speaking, why the connection between LGBTQ2S plus and disaster research matters in general and why it's relevant, I think. Because we do know that generally speaking, disasters expose and exacerbate inequities, including those having to do with gender and gender identity and sexuality and sexual orientation and so on. And a handful of studies that do look at this topic also have shown that there are specific impacts to this community that are along the lines of the ways in which disasters disrupt social processes and safe spaces that are important to everyday resilience for folks who identify with this community. That disasters move people apart in certain ways and also force people together in other ways. That they interrupt important services and medical services and supports and mental health and things like that. They exacerbate poverty, they exacerbate homelessness and insecurity of housing, they increase marginalization, exclusion, and discrimination, and that there are also longer-term impacts of recovery processes that have specific deleterious effects on folks in this community. We also know, I think, more now that there are certain capacities and resiliences generated by living everyday homophobia and everyday transphobia that can come into play during a crisis. Things like the fact that a lot of these LGBTQ2S plus communities have very innovative social networks and very kind of unorthodox forms of social capital that don't necessarily neatly fit into existing understandings of social capital. And I'll talk a little bit more about what I mean by social capital in a moment. That there are the fact that people in this community have the ability to identify vulnerabilities that go under the radar of typical understandings of vulnerability, typical assessments of vulnerability by planners and folks who do this every day. And then that development of community appropriate coping mechanisms to mitigate those vulnerabilities also takes place in specific ways that could come to bear in a disaster, and that queer and trans folks contribute to disaster recovery, to community resilience building in important ways as well. Yet they aren't typically sought out when thinking about what communities can do to plan for a hazard or a disaster. So I shared with you my background and how I came to this topic, and I situated some of that in some literature around that topic. And now I'm going to move on to some of the empirical things that I looked at for my master's, or pardon me, for my PhD. And I know that you heard recently from my former supervisor, David Edgington, about some of the scope of the 2011 disasters. So I won't go too deeply into that, but I would probably be remiss to not mention those here, at least, because this was the scope of those disasters, and that was the context in which I was studying these issues. So here is a map of the highly impacted area of the region of Japan known as Tohoku, with some key cities of focus that I looked at for my PhD work. And this map, I'll say, was created by none other than the great Eric Leinberger at UBC Geography. He's a very talented person. So here's how I went about looking at that issue. The primary source of my data was 37 semi-structured interviews with folks involved in 17 LGBT plus community groups operating in impacted prefectures of Iwate, Miyagi, and Fukushima. And I was interested in their experiences prior to, during, and after the disasters there. In addition to those interviews, as a participatory component of my research, I also attended monthly meetings, participated in volunteer outreach activities with the groups. I translated their materials and distributed them. I provided language interpreting services during events for the groups, such as pride parades and marches. And my family and I also attended several such marches and demonstrations organized by those groups. My analysis included geographical features of the places where the groups were located, including proximity to the shorelines and the types of surrounding terrain and distance from other towns and cities, and the differential impacts of the 3/11 disasters in those communities, such as the extent of damage, rates of mortality, and numbers of evacuees. And I also visited a lot of local town halls, mayor's offices, community centers, disaster memorials, schools, other nonprofits that weren't explicitly targeting LGBT communities. And those visits also enabled around 20 informal discussions with municipal employees, professors, teachers, town hall staff, community center workers, and local residents and other community stakeholders. So this is just a quick pic of one of the parades we went to when we helped organize the first ever Morioka Iwate Rainbow March. That's my wife Aki on the right, with our son Jasper, who is currently much bigger than he was in this picture. But that was part of the field work, and it was a really, really great experience. And yeah, I'm really grateful that I was able to contribute to that. And I think it's important to just acknowledge that, you know, our work should not be extractive when we deal with communities in this way. And you know, inevitably there are power inequities involved in research and field work. But yeah, I think it's important to think about ways that we can give something back in exchange for people's labor and time and giving us the information that they give us, and whatever that looks like for your specific project. So another photo of Jasper having lunch on a seawall with me. This is in Higashi Matsushima, where the concrete seawalls post 2011 were built around the area of Shichigahama, actually. So some of the key findings from that research were things like barriers encountered by LGBT folks post-disaster included lack of gender-inclusive spaces, having to list gender in intake forms, for example, you know, having to choose between men's and women's bathrooms, not having access to inclusive facilities for bathing and for changing clothes, supplies, sanitary supplies, challenges associated with not being able to access shelters with a same-sex spouse, and then longer-term lack of access to assistance funds, spousal grievance allowances, and things like that. Those are just a few of the barriers that folks encountered in this community. And those barriers, importantly, were not anticipated by the plans in place at the time of those disasters, because no one from this community was involved in planning for that disaster. So the LGBT community itself in this region kind of had to respond to these challenges using their own resources and their own expertise generated by their own experiences of everyday heteronormativity and cisnormativity, meaning the ways that they had to navigate life in Tohoku as marginalized LGBT folks. And one of the outcomes of their response was the proliferation of these civil society groups in that region that supported LGBT folk in the region. So prior to those disasters, there was something like 6 groups in that whole region of Tohoku on the map that I showed you. But that number grew quite a bit. And during my fieldwork, I counted roughly 18 groups actually that were operating, and their membership had grown immensely around that time as well. So the findings here included a critique, importantly, of the notion of effectiveness, I think. Effectiveness in disaster resilience, effectiveness in meeting their goals. And the goals, I think, of these groups, I think they were effective in meeting their own goals like providing a safe space for queer and trans survivors to hang out and have some privacy and not have to like edit their words and recollections when they recalled their experience of the disasters, not having to leave out the fact that he was with his husband or she was with her wife, for example, for fear of outing themselves. So they met the goals that they had, like, for example, offering baths and haircuts to people who didn't strongly identify with men's or women's facilities that were on offer at the shelters that were set up by the Japan Self-Defense Forces. Goals like those are not easy to measure by standards that exist in the world of disaster research and planning. But measurability is not a precondition for effectiveness. And measurement really is just a way of translating information from one world or worldview to another. And so I think that points to the onus on us, we academics, planners, civil servants, funding agencies, transnational institutions, that we ought to look more carefully at our own measuring sticks and the assumptions inherent in the worlds in which they are created, the worlds in which we work and do research and think about these issues. And that to better support and incorporate underserved communities in disaster resilience planning, which is all over the mantras of all these different kind of agencies and state-funded projects that I see where I live, that in order to do that, that it's really critical to learn what are the values, what are the goals, what are the needs that are important to those quote unquote underserved communities now, before a disaster, rather than afterwards. Okay, bye Jasper. So how might this work translate into other places and contexts? I finished the work at UBC. I defended my project on Zoom in 2020 December. 2020 December, people. Oh my God, wasn't that a fun time? I got the offer to come down here to Oregon to do a postdoc, and I accepted. I hadn't seen my family in 3 years. The border was closed. I was like, hell yeah, let's get out of here and go, leave the big city and go down to Oregon and rest and just be close to my parents. This is going to be great. But then I have to think about how to apply what I learned in Japan. How do I use the time that I spent in Vancouver to think about the particular human geography of this place now, and how might that apply here? So Oregon is located, as is Vancouver, of course, along the Cascadia subduction zone. And we all have the potential to experience something very similar in scale to what happened in Japan in our lifetimes. And like what happened in Japan, a major earthquake and tsunami along the CSC will cut off communities from lifelines. It will cut off communities from transport, and it'll severely impact people along those lines of inequity, including things that relate to gender and sexuality, but also others. We have a very, very large Latinx community on the coast that is the backbone of our aquaculture and marine industries here. We have tribal communities along the coast. We have poor folks along the coast, a lot of poverty along the coast. We have a lot of differently abled folks and elderly folks along the coast. And this little green star on this map is the approximate location of the city of Newport, where the first phase of my current project is underway now. So this project has been focused primarily in and around the city of Newport, which is basically about 45 minutes due west from where I live now here in Corvallis. It's a small town. It's about 10,000 people, not counting the tourist population, which is pretty substantial depending on the time of year. It is the original place, the ancestral territory of the Yaquina people, who in the 1800s were systematically displaced to a reserve inland, and through a series of treaties and basically underhanded practices to get them out of the way of the settlers, they were absorbed into what is called the Confederated Tribes of the Siletz and put on a reservation inland there. So the total area of Newport is approximately 10.5 square miles. Kilometers are there for you Canadian folk as well. And approximately 9 square miles of which is land, while 1.5 square miles is water. And it's a very low-lying place, as you can see, with basically no protections from the Great Pacific Ocean that it goes facing out onto. It is also mostly dependent on tourism, logging, shipping, and fishing. And a little marine science center is also based here. It's like an Oregon State University extension center where marine science is called the Hatfield Marine Science Center. Is also an employer in this area. And it's also the location of the Central Oregon Coast PFLAG headquarters, which is the Parents and Friends of Lesbian and Gay nonprofit that is basically the most active LGBT supportive nonprofit on the Oregon coast in the entire region. So that's kind of why I chose this place as a place to start this project. So now you have a little bit of background, a lot of background on me actually, and hopefully a pretty detailed understanding of how the current project has come to be. And these are some of the goals that I hope make sense given all of that context. So the first is to contribute to mainstreaming an LGBTQ inclusive lens in local, state, and federal hazard planning and adaptation. Again, you know, folks' needs in that community were not on the radar whatsoever in 2011. And Oregon's state resilience plan was actually drafted in 2013 as a direct result of, well, I shouldn't say direct result, but one of the major factors of impetus to draft that plan was the shock that people had when seeing what happened in Japan. And so we know that something similar is facing us here. And we ought to learn, I think, not only from the seismologists and geophysicists who are helping inform that plan, but also from community experts who experience those disasters and who can look at a policy here and say, no, that's not going to work for us, and here's why. So trying to mainstream some of the inclusive lens needed to address those needs is one goal. Another is integrating hazard awareness and a culture of preparedness into LGBT community events and engagement. And so that knowledge that I just talked about goes the other direction as well. So educating one another on the risks that make us disproportionately vulnerable as members of this community on the CSC. And then also with that knowledge, producing targeted materials for and by community members using data from, for example, the Cascadia COPES Hub, where my postdoc is based. So people producing data on tsunami heights, on the effects of quote unquote islanding on local communities. That is the manner in which communities are expected to be cut off from the rest of the surrounding communities on the coast if a major earthquake and tsunami occurs and destroys a lot of infrastructure. And then importantly, identifying those blue skies needs that respond to marginality in everyday life and are generative of social capital that can grow adaptive capacity in a hazard. So 2 things I'll say about this quickly. Blue skies, for folks who aren't familiar, is a term used by the Red Cross to talk about hazard planning before a hazard strikes. So identifying the community needs that respond to those marginalities during non-hazard times, right now, in other words, that will also contribute to resilience in a hazard, or so-called gray skies. And so that addressing those both at the same time is what I'm trying to deal with now. Which brings me to what we know about adaptation generally and about adapting to changing conditions. So Adgers and a couple other folks who've looked at adaptation very deeply have come up with some of the important attributes that they think make adaptations effective. Things like combining action at different temporal and spatial scales, going household to household or individual to individual, or, scaling up to communities or even to transnational scales. Building resilience in ways that involve altering the way resources and capacities are configured in society. Who has access to the emergency caches that are in those storage containers up on hills in some of the coastal communities here? Who decides what goes into them? How are they going to be distributed to folks if roads are cut off and you have to live out of those for weeks or months, right? And then effective adaptations can arise spontaneously in reaction to perceived and actual risks. They're not always, not always in a disaster, but that you can adapt to everyday risks and everyday marginalities, to feeling like you're in danger, for example. To change the way that you stand or walk down the street if you think you might not be safe to hold your partner's hand walking down a street, things like that. And then also that they can be intentionally planned as well in response to those same risks. So maybe the threat is real, and in that case you intentionally design adaptations in order to make yourself safer and your community safer. So with that in mind, I think most of you are familiar with social capital, but this is just a couple of notes about some of the three main types that social scientists have come up with to identify the ways in which the kind of accumulation of resources that emerges from relationships and networks contributes to resilience. And that is primarily, at this time, people think through these three main types. That is bonding, which is ties between individuals with a relatively high degree of network closure. So people who identify very closely with the group that they're in, and horizontal ties is what some folks refer to those as. So people who are close to the people in their social group. The other is bridging ties, which refers to the ties between individuals across different groups or across different social boundaries. And then the other is linking, or networks of trusting relationships between people who are interacting across institutionalized power or authority gradients in society. So in my example, there is a great deal of bonding. The community that I deal with in Newport, the LGBT community and activist community there, is very, very bonded. There's a lot of community outreach and events happening on the coast, but people are really, really wanting more of them. There is not a lot of bridging between different groups on the coast. Like, for example, there's a lot of Latinx, as I mentioned, a lot of Latinx immigrants on the coast. But there aren't a lot of like Latinx heritage nights where there's also LGBT booths happening, or different ways that, for example, like aquaculture and marine, like sometimes we have like seafood festivals. There aren't like people involved in the seafood industry who are thinking about how to incorporate more ties between the LGBT community. Like, that's just not really happening. And then with linking, there is a surprising amount of linking going on in some circles in this community. There are a few city councilors who identify openly as LGBT, for example, in the city of Newport. There are folks in the Chamber of Commerce who are working to make Newport a very friendly city to diversity. So some of that activity has been emerging through the research that I've been doing so far, and I'll give you more information on how that emerged in a minute. So here are what I feel are some of the some of the ways that disaster studies pertain to social capital, and some of the pertinent kind of connections that I see emerging between that field and what I'm looking at. Social capital can have as much or even greater effects on the rates of disaster recovery and the quality of disaster recovery than physical infrastructure. And social adaptations and the accompanying resilience strategies that come with those often receive less attention and resources than adaptations to infrastructure and to the built environment. People tend to think more about how to move neighborhoods up a hill or away from, the shoreline before they think about how to grow bridging and linking and bonding in a community. I mean, with good reason, of course. We have to get people's bodies away from the threat, but I think it's important to also think about how to grow those other types of resilience through the methods that I just talked about. And then also, most empirical disaster studies are, of course, obviously focused on the recovery phase after an event takes place, including a small number of studies looking at LGBT experiences. People go into the disaster right after it happens, do a bunch of interviews, collect a bunch of data, get out of there and write about it. Like that process is something I'm not interested in participating in. Some folks, some of my friends in this field actually have written about that as disaster gold rushing, basically like going in and grabbing the what is it called, perishable data. Like it's a very extractive approach to I think to understanding how disasters happen. So I'm trying to differentiate my work from some of that approach. And then social capital can grow every day in ways that may not seem directly connected to a hazard. So as I said, blue sky needs, addressing those needs is a way of growing social capital. And it doesn't have to be during a disaster. It can, or after a disaster. It shouldn't be after a disaster. It should be before. That's why addressing those blue sky needs is so important, I think. And so that, as a means of growing adaptive capacity in a hazard, is what I'm looking at and what I'm interested in. So I think these are some of the unanswered questions that I would like to tease out of some of those frameworks that I just shared with you. How do existing social capital frameworks account for everyday marginalization? How does being an underserved or marginalized person in a group of people that is not typically involved in these kinds of studies, how does that change the way that social capital frameworks ought to account for those needs and for those adaptive capacities? And how does an abundance of only one or two dimensions of social capital, for example, bridging or bonding in the case of my community, or a unidirectional form of social capital, for example, if you have a very high level of linking to policymakers in the community, but that's not really reciprocated back by policymakers into your community, what does that do to social capital? And then what can be learned by studying these processes in the prevention and preparedness phase rather than in that recovery phase where most empirical studies of disasters take place? What can we learn now during this blue skies period in Oregon? And then by not assuming an epistemological position of these underserved communities, LGBTQ, but also other underserved communities as discrete and separate objects of study, how might the findings be different? So what I'm aiming to do with this project currently in Newport is to answer some of those questions. And in the process to try and grow resilience and adaptive capacity with the communities that I work with on the coast. And here's what we've done so far. So last year I established a community advisory committee that was made up of local queer and trans members of this community on the coast with perspectives of the Newport City Council, Lincoln County, which is the county in which Newport is situated, folks on the county commission there, the emergency management, folks from emergency management here in this state, and also a lot of grassroots civil society activists who do work toward LGBT resilience every day. So folks in those communities, I have currently 4 people on the advisory committee now. It fluctuates a little bit. Some people need to kind of rotate in and out of that position because people are doing important work every day. They don't have time to always give to this project. But and one of the main goals of having this community advisory committee is to not add to the burden of labor that people doing this work already have. So I try really hard to make sure that once someone gives a lot of advice and direction to the project, that I encourage them to stop and leave the committee, and then invite them in as a different, less onerous contributor later down the line, but that we get a lot of different voices and a lot of different participants to take on that role. I attended city council meetings and chamber of commerce meetings in Newport where queer and trans issues were themes. One of the city councilors in Newport had a big luncheon where she talked about how so-called rainbow capitalism is a way of incorporating a friendly image of Newport for the tourists that come here, and that can grow the local economy if we present the city as explicitly friendly for LGBT folks. And I also attended and co-organized community events and gatherings in the community on the coast. One of the ways I did that was by joining the Newport Pride Organizing Committee that contributed to the event planning and execution for this 2022 Newport Pride Festival. It was the first ever Pride March in the city of Newport last year in September. And ahead of that Pride event, my research partners and I co-produced a survey instrument with, as I said, those community advisory committee members and a couple other folks from the community and a couple of colleagues from the Cascadia Copes Hub. And so we designed this survey. It was about 20 questions long. The goal was to identify some of the assets and important vulnerabilities and resiliences of the community, and to gauge the level of community knowledge of a Cascadia subduction zone event, whether people knew where to go and what they should do in order to stay safe. We collected about 90 responses at Newport Pride. We set up a booth there and distributed the survey via paper and also on Qualtrics with iPads, and handed out a lot of informational materials, hazard maps, evacuation routes, and things like that to people, and also sunglasses with the logo of our research group on them. So it never hurts to have some swag in order to bring people into your project and encourage participation. This is just a photo of one portion of the event. This was like a fun fair, and there were a lot of different community groups there. And there was also some haters there. We are in a very tricky and tenuous time here in the US right now and elsewhere, but people are heckling people, and there's a lot of scary legislation on the books in certain states, Oregon not being one of them at this time, fortunately. But there were people trying to infiltrate the event, and someone said that there was someone from the Proud Boys, which is like a hate group that comes and tries to mess with people at events like this, a trolling kind of thing. I didn't experience it personally, but that is there. That's something that, again, is a part of navigating everyday homophobia and transphobia. But overall, the event went really well. And as I said, we collected about 90 responses to the survey at that event. So it was a very, very productive experience. And it was very interesting for me as someone who hasn't worked with surveys before, because my background is mostly in qualitative research. So here are some of the key things that were identified through the analysis, and part of that included this sort of technique of hybrid inductive and deductive coding, trying to identify themes that I could tease out from the data that I connected through like proxies to different aspects of social capital. I won't go terribly deeply into that, but I can talk about it more later if there are questions. But the themes were discomfort interacting with faith-based groups. So folks did not want to interact with churches and any groups that had to do with religion in the event of a disaster. And we know that faith-based groups play an important role in post-disaster recovery and emergency response. So that is important. Also, the perception of vulnerability in emergency shelters. People did not feel like they would be safe in emergency shelters in a Cascadia subduction zone earthquake. And I'll talk about each of these in a little more detail with some examples in just a minute, but I'm just going to keep running through them for now. Importance of trusted sources of information. Nowadays, you can find information to support just about any view that you have. So people are very cognizant of where the information comes from and whether it applies to them as members of the LGBT community. The desire for more community cohesion and connections, more events, more opportunities to do things like pride marches and parades and festivals, more opportunities to interact in a social environment with other folks who identify with that community. And then everyday intersecting vulnerabilities. So for example, being both unhoused and transgender. This theme emerged in an important way that I think speaks back to that notion of blue skies needs. And last but not least, a lack of institutional support for folks who are experiencing vulnerability in this community. So to get quickly into each of these, I'll just give you some examples from the surveys and from some of the field notes that I performed the analysis with in this first phase. The theme of discomfort interacting with faith-based groups came out in ways like this. These are quotes from folks who answered the survey in the sections where there was open-ended text allowed, and also in conversations and meetings that I attended in some of those functions that I mentioned. So I might be okay to accept food from a food bank out of that church, but I don't want anything to do with the Salvation Army. Salvation Army is one of the faith-based groups that often serves people in crisis and including in disaster, post-disaster environments. They're very, very homophobic and Christian-based. And they've made some public statements indicating that such. So a lot of misgivings by folks in this community about dealing with groups like that. I'm not going anywhere near the church. I know where I'm not welcome. So again, we know that faith-based groups are a major contributor to disaster response in the U.S. and elsewhere. And so the notion that people wouldn't want to interact with those groups, I think, speaks to the specific vulnerabilities potentially facing this community in the event of a disaster. The perception of vulnerability in shelters. So I asked people, like, where would you go in the case of a major crisis if your home were destroyed in a major event? I would go to the woods was one. People would talk about staying in their vehicles. People talked about keeping their vehicles stocked with supplies, keeping a go bag in their trunks just for this purpose because they don't want to stay at a shelter. They'd rather just, camp in their car. I would stay in my condos, HOA, at the event space that we have because it has emergency supplies in it. It's funny, this particular person shared that they would stay at this HOA, which is basically like a HOA. What is HOA? It's like a strata, right? So they have this space at this condo where folks can go for events, and I actually was able to like GPS locate the space itself that this person was referring to, and realize that it's about 50 feet from the shoreline of the beach. So not the best place to stay, even if there are emergency supplies there. And then I would evacuate to any state parks that made it through the event. So people really did indicate that an emergency shelter would not be an ideal place for them where they would feel safe. And they directly named the reason being that they weren't sure that it would be a safe place because of their identity as LGBT. And then trusted sources of information. I would reach out to Facebook communities. I would rely on online groups that I'm a part of. There are a lot of online groups on Facebook and Twitter and others that where people, share information that they think affects their community, their LGBT community in the coast. They're very, very robust. And so that would be a major source of information for folks. And then key theme number 4, a desire for more community cohesion and connections. I know a couple of LGBT people, but I wouldn't say that there's a community per se, is what one person said. And other folks just said something along the lines of, this community is just emerging. It's just kind of becoming now. And this is like a rather new thing in this community. So on one hand, people are feeling the desire for more connection, and on the other hand, I think there are a lot of signs that community is really coalescing and becoming more robust. So a lot of hope for that type of activity, I think. And then this notion of everyday intersecting vulnerabilities. This is a rather long quote, but I'll just read it out. This is by a person who works with unhoused folks at another nonprofit, and whose specific focus is LGBT youth. And so this person shared with me that when it comes down to the nitty-gritty of actually getting people access to services and things they need, This is referring to unhoused trans and queer youth. When it comes down to getting those youth things they need, the providers want to know the birth certificate gender before they help out that trans kid, even just to get into a shelter. And these are youth who ran away from home because their parents disowned them. So the kid gets depressed in the shelter, in other words, lashes out, dyes their hair, doesn't want to go back to the shelter. So this is just a way of understanding how those intersecting vulnerabilities contribute to one another and kind of overlap with one another and end up driving people into more deep experiences of vulnerability in blue skies, I think. And then last key theme, the lack of institutional support in the community. So we do not have resources. We broke ground for 36 units of low-income housing, but not one of those is designated for LGBT. It's about finding solutions in the moment, minute by minute. We don't have the luxury of documenting everything and going through these institutional channels. So if there's a disaster tomorrow and my building collapsed, nobody would know what this community needs or how to get it to them. That information's only in my head. There's no guidebook for how to support LGBT people in a disaster. There's no established safe sources of information and resources for folks here. So this person's concerned because she knows that information, but what if she's buried under disaster rubble? I mean, you know, who's gonna step in my place if I'm hurt in a hazard and a disaster, in other words. And then last, I try to keep really good relationships with cisgender heterosexual folks, like the leader of Cascadia Relief. It's one of the nonprofit grassroots relief hazard disaster response groups on the coast, because at some point we will need them, but that's all unofficial. Again, when stuff happens, there's no guarantee that people will help. So this person actually, I think, interestingly, is really thinking about how to pay into that notion of social capital, so that when stuff hits the fan, she'll be able to make a withdrawal, is what she's hoping, in a way that will serve the community and address those needs. So what is this all kind of driving at? Community adaptive capacity is in the case of this project for me, is identifying those co-benefits to address both blue sky and gray sky needs. Blue sky adaptations respond to everyday life problems, to everyday life marginality and challenges. And then adaptive capacities for the disaster, those are on the right. And what I'm driving at is that sweet spot, the co-benefits and the tools for community adaptive capacity that can deal with both. Because people living in crisis, people living under heteronormative patriarchy and racism and homelessness, they don't have time to think about a go bag. They only have time to think about where they're going to get their next meal. You know, so how do you align those things in a way that can speak to both? Because they certainly aren't mutually exclusive. On the contrary, we need to address both at the same time. And so, how to do that? Okay, so this is kind of the framework that I've been coming up with, and I'm drawing heavily from Daniel Aldrich's work, as well as a couple other people who have come up with analytical frameworks to think about community adaptive capacity and community capital in a way that can speak to those themes. And so, I guess what I'm trying to tease out through this rather complicated at first sight framework is what are the forms of social capital and how do they look in different scales and contexts? What are some examples that show what those look like in this particular marginalized community? And then who are the stakeholders that can speak to those? Who are the people who hold that power in the community and beyond, you know, at different levels of governance, for example? And then what are those key issues and barriers? People in Japan identified key issues and barriers after the fact. How does this analytical framework help us understand what those are before a disaster strikes? And then how do we build that into this research? How do we design questions and protocols for collecting data that can tease those things out and help us design tools and figure out what those are? What are those community capitals? So all of this, again, informs how we think about interview questions and research protocols for engaging folks in marginalized communities more effectively and more appropriately in terms of how they want to be engaged. It's not just about thinking about what people need and then shoving it up and, you know, saying, here's what you need. We have to ask and figure out how and why and in what capacity those people want us to engage with them. And that's a big important thing missing from a lot of the work that I think we disaster research folks do. So that is the current phase. I'd like to incorporate that data collection and protocol process and analytical framework into the design of some of those, again, blue sky queer social capital indicators and adaptations, and then co-develop tools and practices and trainings to grow community adaptive capacity in both blue and gray skies. So here are the questions that I'm looking at now, and this is where my project is currently right now. So what are the blue sky needs, priorities, and community assets of LGBTQ2S+ communities on the coast? How do they relate more broadly to other underserved communities and adaptive capacities to hazards? I don't want to just focus on this one community because, again, this is not a discrete unit of analysis. These are real people with different identities that overlap and intersect with one another. So how do we scale up some of that to address other forms of marginality that exist here on the Oregon coast? What barriers exist to integration of those needs, priorities, and assets of underserved communities into processes for disaster risk and disaster risk reduction is what I meant to say there. And how can those be mitigated? How do we get rid of those barriers or at least assuage them? And then what training, capacity, and adaptation practices that respond to marginality, equity, and livability in everyday life are also generative of social capital that can grow adaptive capacity in a hazard? How do we make life better today and in a crisis, right? Can't do just one or the other. We don't have that luxury. So the next steps I'm working on are scaling, as I said, to other local marginalized communities, looking specifically at folks in the COPES hub. Felicia, who's here today, is one of the people who's been involved in this work, but working with Latinx communities and immigrant communities on the coast, working with tribal communities. Some other folks from those communities are in the process of collaborating with me, or I with them, about how we can think through some of the practices that can respond to everyday needs in those communities, and then also including local emergency managers and first responders in some of these municipalities to think about how we can get those people in the same room with some of these folks, connecting those worldviews and those epistemologies more directly in spaces, right? And having those productive conversations across those linking boundaries, and then developing revised interview questions, survey instruments, other data collection protocols with communities. One of the most fruitful feedback I received on that survey as we co-developed it was from people who, took it in the community and said, this doesn't make any sense. This is wrong. Like, just letting people try it out and come up with better questions. That was really, really helpful. And then expanding geographical scope beyond Newport to other coastal towns and cities with different socioeconomic and geographical attributes along the coastline, along the CSC. And then ultimately, maybe the creation of a people's guide to coastal community resilience, something that specifically talks about the needs of folks in specific communities that speaks their language and has specific information that can pertain to them in a disaster. We have a lot of tailored resources. We have in Newport, there's a guide for people who work on fishing boats that says, okay, if you're this far from the sea, you should pull up your anchor and do this. Or if you're this far from the shoreline, you should go further out. Like, there's specific instructions that anticipate where folks in that community will be based on knowledge that they obviously contributed to creating those materials. So why can't we do something similar for folks in other communities that we know are on the coast in order to think through where they might be and in what capacity they might experience a disaster, and design a kind of guide for folks that way? So those are just some ideas that I have for next steps. That is all that I have to share with you today. Thank you so much for listening to this extremely long talk, and I would be delighted to take any of your questions.